Cristiano Ronaldo, Paul Pogba, Jadon Sancho, Bruno Fernandes, Marcus Rashford, Casemiro, Raphael Varane. On paper, this wasn't supposed to be a rebuild. It was supposed to be the beginning of Manchester United's return to the top of English football. A Ballon d'Or winner, a World Cup winner, Champions League winners, one of Europe's most exciting young wingers, one of the Premier League's most productive attacking midfielders, the goalkeeper who had already won the Premier League Golden Glove. And enough money, history, and global attention to make almost any footballer want to join them. Yet somehow this collection of superstars became one of the strangest failures of the modern Premier League. And that's the question we need to answer. How did Manchester United's super team fail? Because this wasn't a squad lacking talent, it wasn't a squad lacking experience, it wasn't a squad lacking money, and it certainly wasn't a squad lacking famous names. So what went wrong? Was it the managers? Was it the players? Was it recruitment? Was it the tactics? Was it the pressure of playing for Manchester United? Or was the biggest problem something much simpler? Maybe Manchester United kept buying the answer to the wrong question. And by the time they realized it, the super team was already falling apart. If you enjoy football stories that go deeper than the scoreline, subscribe to the Ballers Zone, because every week we're breaking down the players, teams, and decisions that created some of football's most fascinating stories. And this one begins with a player who was supposed to be the symbol of Manchester United's future. Paul Pogba. Pogba's story at Manchester United was already complicated before Ronaldo, Sancho, or Casemiro arrived. He had originally left United as a teenager in 2012, moved to Juventus, and developed into one of the most exciting midfielders in world football. At Juventus, he became a star. He won league titles. He played Champions League football. He became a French international. And in 2016, Manchester United decided to bring him home.
I'm back.
This was supposed to be the perfect reunion. United had lost one of the most talented young players they had produced, watched him become a superstar somewhere else, and then spent a world record fee for a midfielder to bring him back. Pogba was going to be the centerpiece, the midfielder who would take United back to the top. But almost immediately, something became clear. Pogba was brilliant, but nobody seemed completely sure what his best position was. Was he a number 6, a number 8, a number 10? Should he control the game from deep? Should he attack the box? Should he be given complete freedom? The answer seemed to change depending on the manager. And this was the first warning sign. Manchester United weren't building a system around a specific identity. They were trying to find a system that could accommodate whichever superstar was currently available. Pogba could produce moments of extraordinary quality, but football isn't simply about collecting extraordinary moments. You need structure around those moments, and United never really solved that problem. Jose Mourinho tried to build a competitive team around Pogba and other experienced players. They finished second in the Premier League in 2017-18. They reached a Europa League final and won it. There were signs that United could still become a serious force. But the team never developed into the dominant side supporters imagined. Mourinho eventually left. Ole Gunnar Solskjaer arrived, and suddenly the club had another idea. Young players, transitions, counter-attacking football. Bruno Fernandes arrived in January 2020 and immediately changed the attacking personality of the team. And this is where the story gets interesting, because Bruno wasn't just good. He was productive. He scored, he assisted, he created, he demanded the ball. He played with the personality of someone who believed every attack should go through him. And Manchester United needed exactly that. For a while it worked. Bruno became the creative heartbeat of the team. United improved. They finished third in the league in 2019-20, then second in 2020-21. They reached a Europa League final. They were beginning to look like a team that could challenge again, but there was still a problem hiding underneath the improvement. United were becoming dependent on individual brilliance. If Bruno produced, United produced. If Rashford found space, United became dangerous. If Pogba found his rhythm, the midfield suddenly looked different. If the counterattack worked, United looked terrifying. But there wasn't always a clear mechanism for making these players better together. The team had talent. What it lacked was a reliable identity. Then came the summer of 2021, and everything changed, because Manchester United decided to bring back the player who had left the club 12 years earlier, Cristiano Ronaldo.
Manchester United have signed.
This wasn't a normal transfer. This was football mythology. Ronaldo had become one of the greatest goal scorers in the history of the sport. He had won the Champions League multiple times. He had won league titles in England, Spain, and Italy. He had won the Ballon d'Or. And now, at 36 years old, he was returning to Old Trafford. The reaction was enormous. Manchester United supporters were celebrating. Social media exploded. Shirts were being sold. The atmosphere changed overnight, and initially Ronaldo delivered. He scored twice on his second debut against Newcastle. He scored in the Champions League. He scored important goals. He finished the season as United's leading scorer, but something else was happening. The team was changing around him. And this is where the super team began to become a puzzle, because Ronaldo was still Ronaldo. But Ronaldo in his prime and Ronaldo at 36 were not exactly the same player. He wasn't going to spend the entire match pressing like a young forward. He wanted to operate near the box. He wanted chances. He wanted service, and if United were going to maximize him, the team needed to create an environment where he could receive that service. That sounds simple. But it created a tactical problem. United already had Bruno, they had Pogba, they had Rashford, they had Mason Greenwood, they had Edinson Cavani, and now they had Ronaldo. 5 players who wanted attacking responsibility. 5 players who could influence the final third. But a football team doesn't get stronger simply because you add another great attacker. Sometimes adding one more superstar makes the puzzle harder. And United were about to discover that the team wasn't balanced. There was a growing gap between the attack and midfield. The midfield struggled to control games, the defense was exposed, and suddenly the club that had just brought Ronaldo home was looking increasingly unstable. Solskjaer was eventually dismissed, and Michael Carrick took temporary charge before Ralph Rangnick arrived. Rangnick was supposed to bring a new tactical identity, pressing, intensity, structure, but the transition wasn't smooth. Ronaldo's presence created questions about pressing. The super team was beginning to look less like a super team and more like a collection of separate pieces. Then came another huge summer. Manchester United needed midfield control. They needed a defensive leader. They needed another elite attacker, so they signed 3 players who on paper seemed to solve all 3 problems. So now look at the squad: Ronaldo, Sancho, Rashford, Bruno. Pogba was still around at this point, and yet the question remained, how were all of these players supposed to fit together? Then Erik ten Hag arrived, and this is where the story takes another turn. Ten Hag had built his reputation at Ajax through structured possession football. His teams pressed, they built from the back, they controlled games. Players had clear positional responsibilities. The football had an identity. That was exactly what Manchester United needed. For the first time in years, there was a manager who appeared to have a very clear idea of what he wanted. A squad built by several previous managers with completely different ideas. This wasn't Ten Hag's team. It was the result of years of recruitment, and that meant he had to solve problems that existed before he arrived. Ronaldo quickly became one of them. Ten Hag wanted intensity. Ronaldo's role became increasingly complicated. The relationship between player and manager became tense. Ronaldo eventually left the club in November 2022, and just like that, the biggest star in the squad was gone. But this should have been good news for the rebuild. Now Ten Hag could build his system without needing to accommodate Ronaldo, and for a while it looked like the plan was working. Casemiro became one of United's most important players. Marcus Rashford had an incredible scoring season. Bruno continued producing. United became more competitive. They won the League Cup. They finished 3rd in the Premier League. Suddenly, people were talking about a comeback. Maybe this was finally the beginning of the new Manchester United, but there was still something missing, because when you look closely, the same problem kept appearing. United could produce good football, they could win matches, they could beat big teams, but they weren't consistently controlling games. They still relied heavily on individual moments, and the squad had enormous structural problem. Casemiro was aging, Varane was dealing with injuries, the defense was constantly changing. The midfield lacked a consistent ball-progressing controller. The attack didn't have enough natural width and consistency, and some of the biggest signings weren't producing at the levels expected. Sancho was the clearest example. At Dortmund, he looked unstoppable. At Manchester United, he never consistently reproduced that version of himself, and the pressure became enormous. Every missed chance was analyzed. Every poor performance became a headline. Every training ground story became part of the discussion. Then came the public disagreement between Sancho and Ten Hag. The relationship deteriorated. Sancho eventually left on loan. Another expensive signing had become another unresolved problem. And this is where we need to ask a difficult question. Was Sancho a bad player? No. Was he suddenly incapable of playing football? Of course not. So why did one of Europe's most exciting young attackers look so ordinary at Manchester United? Because again, the environment mattered. The system, the pressure, the expectations, the constant managerial changes, the tactical uncertainty, and the enormous weight of the Manchester United shirt. The same thing that had happened to Pogba was now happening to Sancho. A talented player entered a club that didn't have a stable footballing identity, and suddenly the player was expected to solve problems that weren't entirely his fault. And the cycle continued. Big signing, huge expectations, inconsistent performance, manager changes, new tactics, new role, more criticism, then another signing to fix the previous problem. This is how a super team becomes a revolving door. But perhaps the biggest misunderstanding about Manchester United's squad was the belief that talent automatically creates chemistry. It doesn't. Imagine putting 11 brilliant musicians in a room. If none of them agrees on the tempo, the result isn't beautiful music, it's noise. Football works the same way. Ronaldo needed service, Bruno needed freedom, Pogba needed space and protection, Sancho needed combinations and confidence, Rashford needed space to attack, Casemiro needed runners ahead of him, Varane needed defensive stability around him. Every player had strengths, but those strengths didn't always complement one another, and sometimes they created weaknesses. Ronaldo's lack of pressing meant other players had to cover more ground. Bruno's aggressive positioning could leave space behind him. Pogba's role required protection. Casemiro's strengths were more defensive than creative. Sancho wanted to receive the ball in certain attacking areas. Rashford wanted space, so the manager had to solve a massive tactical equation. Who presses, who controls, who progresses, who protects, who creates, who sacrifices. And perhaps the biggest question of all, who is the team actually built around? United never had a convincing answer for long enough. At Real Madrid, Ronaldo was surrounded by a structure designed to maximize him. At Juventus, the club rebuilt its attack around him. At Barcelona, Messi was surrounded by players who understood exactly how to feed him. At Manchester United, Ronaldo arrived in a team still trying to figure out its identity. That may be the single biggest lesson from this story. When Manchester United bought Ronaldo, they didn't buy Real Madrid's structure. When they bought Casemiro, they didn't buy Toni Kroos. They didn't buy Luka Modric. They didn't buy Dani Carvajal. They didn't buy the entire defensive and midfield ecosystem that allowed Casemiro to become Casemiro. When they bought Sancho, they didn't buy Borussia Dortmund's attacking structure. And when they bought Pogba, they didn't buy the Juventus team that knew how to protect his weaknesses and exploit his strengths. They bought individual pieces, but they needed a blueprint. And without the blueprint, the pieces never fully became a machine. That is why this team failed, not because it lacked superstars, because it had too many superstars and not enough structure. The super team was never really a super team. It was a collection of superstars assembled during different eras under different managers for different tactical philosophies. And that's why the names were bigger than the football. On a graphic, the squad looked terrifying. On a football pitch, the pieces didn't always make sense. And perhaps that's why this story is so fascinating, because it proves something that football fans often forget. Football isn't played on paper. On paper, Ronaldo, Pogba, Bruno, Sancho, Casemiro, and Varane sounds almost unfair. But on the pitch, football asks different questions. Can they defend together? Can they press together? Can they build together? Can they sacrifice for each other? And most importantly, can 11 talented players become one team? Manchester United never found a convincing answer for long enough. And that's how a squad filled with players who had won World Cups, Champions Leagues, league titles, and individual awards became a story about what happens when talent isn't connected by a clear idea. The problem was the constant cycle. Every new manager inherited someone else's decisions. Every new manager wanted different players. Every new player changed the balance. Every change created another adjustment. And instead of building one team over time, United repeatedly started again. That's why the super team failed, not with one explosion, but through years of small cracks. And perhaps the most painful conclusion is this: Manchester United didn't fail because they couldn't attract world-class footballers. They failed because attracting world-class footballers was never the same thing as building a world-class team. The names were there, the talent was there, the money was there, the history was there, the supporters were there. What was missing was the connection between all of it. Clear tactical identity, a coherent recruitment strategy, a stable footballing structure, and enough patience to let those things develop. The super team didn't need another superstar, it needed a blueprint. And by the time Manchester United realized that the super team was already gone, Pogba was gone, Ronaldo was gone, Sancho's relationship with the club had broken down, Varane had moved on. The great names that once made the squad look unbeatable had become chapters in a story about wasted potential. And perhaps that's the final irony. Manchester United spent years trying to build a team capable of returning to the top, but their biggest lesson came from the players they already had. The next great Manchester United team won't be created simply by buying bigger names. It will be created when the club decides exactly what kind of football it wants to play. And then finds players who make that football better, because the greatest teams in football history weren't simply collections of superstars. They were collections of superstars who made sense together. That is the difference between a squad and a team, between talent and chemistry, between names and identity, and ultimately between a super team and a failed super team. Manchester United had the stars, they had the legends, they had the money, they had the moments. They even had the trophies along the way, but they never found the formula. And that's why years later the question still feels almost impossible to answer. How did Manchester United's super team fail? The answer isn't that they had too little talent, it's that they had talent without enough direction. They kept looking for the next superstar when what they really needed was the next system. And in football, sometimes the most expensive player in the squad isn't the missing piece. Sometimes the missing piece is the idea that makes everyone else fit. That was Manchester United's problem. They didn't need more stars, they needed the stars they already had to become a team, and that's exactly what never happened. Thanks for watching. Subscribe the Ballers Zone if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next one.